In our study this evening, what I'd like us to do is turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 21. 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles chapter 21 are parallel, you might say. You think of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the parallel accounts, parallel gospel accounts. Well, 2 Samuel 24, 1 Chronicles 21. But what I'd like to do is just be reading through 1 Chronicles 21, and then we'll refer back to 2 Samuel 24 also as we go. But I do want to, and my charts aren't advancing. There we go. Thank you. Just look at a few passages to set our Old Testament context in our study. In Hebrews chapter 8, in the last part of that verse, I believe he's describing how that Jeremiah, who's quoted in Hebrews chapter 8, Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, looked ahead and he was talking about that new covenant. And the Hebrew writer says, in that he saith, here's Jeremiah, in that Jeremiah says, a new covenant. He, Jeremiah, has made the first old. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. So Jeremiah looked ahead to a time when God would make a new covenant with Israel. In Galatians 3, Paul describes how that the law, the Old Testament law, is described as a guardian, a schoolmaster, and takes us by the hand, leads us to Christ. Now that we're under faith, he drops us off at faith's door, steps away, and he's done his job. That guardian, that schoolmaster, has done its job. The law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith has come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. So Jeremiah looked ahead to that time when God would make a new covenant. When faith came, we're no longer under that first covenant, that old law. But yet, as Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 21, we're under law to Christ. And since we're under law to Christ, I believe we need to look to the New Testament, for the authority for what we do, like Colossians 3, verse 17 tells us, whatsoever you do, in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. So we need authority for what we do, but we're under law to Christ, and so we look to the pages of the New Testament. Let me just go over some review questions, but before we look at that, I do appreciate David's comment on, I just wanted to bring this up again, the woods of Ephraim. I appreciated his comment. And, in that passage that describes the battle with Absalom in the woods and how that the woods devoured more than the sword. And the reason I mention it again is because sometimes I feel remiss in not simply emphasizing what the text says when I do something like that. But here it contrasts the wood with the sword. And maybe there was something inherent in the woods that caused their deaths, wild beasts, the terrain. Perhaps God even had a hand in the matter. And that's in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 6 through 8. God in the time past has used nature. He's used the hornet to drive out the Amorites. He used the plagues in Egypt. But just wanted to mention that briefly. But some review questions. And anytime anyone has a comment, just shout it out. In 2 Samuel chapter 20, what man raised a rebellion against David? Sheba. All right, Sheba, the son of Bichri. What was Sheba's, and this is tongue-in-cheek, but what was Sheba's first major military operation as prospective commander-in-chief of Israel? To run. And so he ran, and where did he go to? Abel of Beth Maacah. And by the way, David, on the pronunciation of Old Testament names, it's my understanding that I've been told that what we don't know how they're pronounced, but what we need to do is just pick a pronunciation and say it confidently. In 2 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 16, Joab besieged the city of Abel. Who of the city of Abel approached Joab to resolve this conflict? So you have Joab and his men besieging the city of Abel. Who was it that approached Joab and resolved it, helped resolve it? Shout it out so I can hear it. Okay, the wise woman. All right, and she, would you just, wipe us out of Israel? Oh no, Joab won't do that. So she conferred with him, and they ended up throwing Sheba's head over the wall. And David mentioned this, there may be a question of time frame in the chronology of the last few chapters of 2 Samuel. Perhaps chapter 21 about the famine in the land might have occurred earlier in David's life rather than after the rebellion of Sheba, even though it's the chapter-wise it's in that sequence. But maybe it could have happened earlier in David's life. But what was the consequence of Saul's sin against the Gibeonites? What was it that was going on in the land? What was the consequence of his sin? Famine in the land, okay. Did the famine end? Right. When you look at chapter David was running out of time, but I just wanted to hone in on that. He wasn't able to cover the last, as I recall, the last few passages. But in and I'm in Kings. Hold on here. 2 Samuel 24. In verse 1, of course, it speaks about and I got the wrong chapter. 21. Chapter 21, there was a famine in the days of David, 3 years. But in verse 14, and the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son buried they in the country of Benjamin in Zebah, in the sepulchre of Kish his father, and they performed all that the king commanded. And after that, God was entreated for the land. I think the implication is that the famine ended. It was a 3-year famine. It ended after he made the sacrifice. And there's reasons I wanted to hone in on that and mention that. I won't go into the details of why I say that, but just it looks to me from the text, the famine ended. Okay, in our study this evening, 1 Chronicles chapter 21, Satan, an adversary, provoked David to number the people. David had Joab and the rulers go from one end of Israel to the other and number the people. Joab protested to David that it would bring guilt upon Israel. While Joab returned the numbers to David, David realized his sin. He confessed it to God and asked God to forgive him for acting foolishly. So let's read in 1 Chronicles 21. And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. And David said to Joab and to the rulers of the people, "Go, number Israel from Beersheba to Dan, even to Dan, and bring the number of them to me, that I may know it." And Joab answered, "The Lord make his people 100 times so many more as they be." If God's with us, He's going to deal with it. Why number the people? He's going to help us. "But my Lord the king, are they not all my Lord's servants? Why then doth my Lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of trespass to Israel?" Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab. Wherefore Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came to Jerusalem. And Joab gave the sum of the number of the people unto David. And all they of Israel were 1,000 and 100,000 men, 1,100 men that drew 1,100,000 men that drew sword. And Judah was 470,000 men that drew sword. But Levi and Benjamin counted he not among them, for the king's word was an abominable to Joab. And God was displeased with this thing. Therefore he smote Israel. And David said unto God, "I have sinned greatly because I have done this thing. But now I beseech thee, do away with the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly." And so David numbered the people. Just some observations on this text. Because of the interaction with the prophet Gad and David coming up in the next section, because of that interaction, Gad, the prophet, comes to David and, gives him a choice of punishment. Because of that interaction, I take it that verse 7 is there maybe as a summary verse, as a heading before he gives the details that follow, and not really saying that God smote Israel before David even confessed his sin. I'm open to your comment. I take it it's a heading a summary in regard, pointing ahead about, and the details are coming. Here's how God was displeased, and here's what he did to Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 24 notes that in 2 Samuel 24, verses 8 and 9, it mentions that it took 9 months and 20 days for Joab and his men to do the work. So they went through the land. It took them 9 months to count the men. Notice the wording in 2 Samuel 24. There are some things that I'll probably for the sake of time and need a further study, I'll observe the Passover on. But I do want to mention something here in 2 Samuel 24 and verse 1. It says, and again, because I have some applications, I think it's very important, some things that this verse covers. And again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David. So, the wording there, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. Perhaps Israel did something we're not told that displeased God. And that event, the undisclosed event of Israel displeasing God in some way, perhaps that event precipitated the numbering of the people. Perhaps. But again, I'm open to your explanation, help in explaining that portion of the verse. But on the wording, he moved David. Okay, I take it the antecedent of that is God. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say. So God moved David. You know, one thing to note, in 1 Chronicles 21, it shows us that Satan tempted David, right? So in what sense here could it be said that David, or that God moved David to number the people? I've got something that I want to bring out and say about that, but any comments on that? How could it be said that God moved David?
Evidently, God was upset. He allowed Satan to do it. We maybe not told everything about it.
That's the way I'd say it, Norm, that and I'll explain more about that, but God moved David in the sense that he allowed Satan to tempt him. Here's some things to consider. Let me make sure see if I have I should have been skipping ahead here on the charts. It may mean that God moved David in the sense that he allowed Satan to tempt David to number the people, which is, what we see in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. Here's some reasons why I say that. Think back to the wording of Job 2, verse 3, when God said to Satan, you moved me against him to destroy him without cause. God said to Satan, Satan, you moved me against David to destroy him. Well, did God act directly on Job? Is that the way it was? No, we look in Job chapter 1, verse 12, God said to Satan, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thy hand. So when Job tells us that, Satan, you moved me against David to destroy him. I destroyed him. Well, how did he do that? He allowed Satan to do it. And so God was in control. He gave Satan the limits, but he simply allowed it. It may be said that God causes something to happen when he allows it to happen or uses indirect means to influence something to happen. And I think about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Just another example. And again, I'm just bringing this out to help understand 2 Samuel 24 and verse 1, that the Lord, if that's the Lord, or if we understand that 1 Chronicles mentions Satan did it, but if here it's the Lord, well, the meaning, I take it, would be that he allowed Satan to do that. He allowed Satan to tempt David to number the people. But here's just another illustration of that. So, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, we might say, but he did it by means. Let's look at a few passages in that. I've got a string of verses on the screen in the book of Exodus where it says in those verses that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Here's a string of verses, and I want to just reference these, where it speaks of Pharaoh hardening his own heart. And here's a string of verses that describes how that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So Pharaoh's heart was hardened. God did it. But how did he do it? Let's look at the middle here. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. In Exodus 8, verse 15, and also 31 and 32, when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, so God sent a plague on Egypt. Maybe you could say that he lifted that plague at just the right time. And when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart and hearkened not unto them. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and he removed the swarm of flies. Maybe he might have done it just at the right time. He removed it, and Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, and he wouldn't let the people go. Chapter 9, verse 34, and when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunders were ceased, he sinned yet more and hardened his heart. So he could tell that things, God relaxed, and then, I can just go back to my old ways. So he hardened his heart. So I take it that that's the way we would understand that type of language. Because, I think we want to remember that we have free choice. How did Joshua say it in Joshua chapter 24 to Israel? Choose you this day whom you will serve. Choose. We have the right to choose. God doesn't force us to do anything. God doesn't make us do anything. God does not, and here's another passage we could look at in application. I'll mention this one, and I'll go back to the other one. God does not tempt man, but allows Satan to tempt us. And I believe that's what we could say is going on with David. God allowed Satan to tempt David to number the people. James chapter 1 describes how that we sin when we're drawn away of our own lust and enticed. We give in. Satan tempts us, not God, and we sin. When we find, just a note in passing here, when we find two seeming conflicting scriptures, maybe chapter 24, verse 1, 1 Chronicles 21, 1, one thing we want to do, first thing I think we want to do is attempt to reconcile those passages. The Bible's not false. So seeming inconsistencies, we need to try to reconcile the two passages, identify how the two passages can both be true. Well, it could be said that God does something, but he does it by means, or he allows it to happen, not that he does it directly. And so both passages are true. And, okay, on the numbering of Joab, just another application. On the numbering of the people by Joab. The point I'm about to make is not necessarily against Joab. So here in that text that we read in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, we saw how that King David commanded his men, Joab and the men, to number Israel. They went and did it. The commandment by the king was abominable to Joab. Joab attempted to reason with the king and say, you want to do this. You're going to cause Israel to sin. So the point I'm about to make is not necessarily against Joab. The text does not specifically speak about Joab, so I'm not going to say. But I do want to segue on the idea that we see in that text, that I want to make this point, that we can't hide behind, someone says, well, Joab, he was clear, it was just David that sinned, he was okay because, someone told him to do something. We're responsible for our actions. We cannot shift responsibility for our own actions away from ourselves onto a higher level entity like our parents, our spouse, the elders, the government. When the Lord tells us to do something, then man tells us to do something else. We've got to obey God. We can't say that, that someone made me do it, someone told me to do it, but yet it was a sin. And again, I'm not saying anything about Joab, but I'm just segueing on that concept that we need to understand. And here's some passages. Acts 5:29, we ought to obey God rather than man. They were told not to preach. They had to do it. Matthew chapter 15, verse 14. Blind guides, both shall fall into the ditch. He taught me, he made me do it or whatever, he influenced me. Both shall fall into the ditch, the blind leader, the blind follower. 1 Kings 13:18, the young prophet was lied to. That old prophet, the old wise prophet, he told me that this was okay. He lied to him, and he died for his disobedience. Daniel 3, bow down to the image. Daniel and his three friends said, we can't do that. So just several examples to show and illustrate basically that we ought to obey God rather than men. Another application on David's sin of numbering the people. And then I'll open it up for any comments on these applications or anything to the text so far before we go ahead. But on David's sin of numbering the people, there were consequences to Israel for David's sin. He sinned, but it caused other people grief. There may be a number of passages we could think about, but I think of Revelation 2, the woman Jezebel who taught and seduced others to sin. So she caused others to sin. Any comments that you all have? Okay, so God had something against Israel. They had sinned in some way, and you may have described the possibilities there. And then so because of that, he moved David via Satan. Okay, good point.
I think it's possible to affirm that God took a more active role in this, really allowing it to happen.
Okay.
Without making it seem like he directly tempted David. You have in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 1 where it says Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. So it seems like the Spirit, for divine purposes, led Jesus to a place where he could be tempted. God himself did not tempt Jesus, but in the example of David, God was angry with David and apparently put him in a position where he could be tempted by
Right. But I might equate those two. Those might, in my mind, I would say are effectively parallel. The Spirit led Jesus, allowing him to be tempted by Satan. God moved David, allowing via Satan. So both were, I might say, were examples of God allowing things to happen. But maybe we could talk more about that. Let's see. In the next section, in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 9. Yes. Okay.
Because in 1 Chronicles 21, the word Satan can also mean adversary.
Adversary.
Adversary could mean a foreign army, and God's raising up a foreign army against them or something like that.
Okay.
Just another possibility for you to talk to someone and say, this is also a way that this is not a contradiction. That's kind of what we're looking at doing.
Okay.
Moving those doubts out of people's way.
Right. So there might be multiple ways in which that could have led to David being tempted to sin.
Kind of like in the New Testament, we don't always translate angelos as angels. Sometimes messengers.
Gotcha. Thank you. Okay, good point. That in 1 Chronicles 21 that David is mentioning could just simply be an adversary and not necessarily Satan himself. In verse 9, the Lord spake unto Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and tell David, saying, Thus saith the Lord, I'll offer thee 3 things. Choose one of them, that I may do it unto thee. So Gad came to David and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, choose thee, either 3 years' famine, or 3 months to be destroyed before thy foes, while that the sword of thine enemies overtaketh thee, or else 3 days the sword of the Lord, even the pestilence in the land, and the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the coast of Israel. Now therefore advise thyself what word I shall bring again to him that sent me. And David said unto Gad, I am in a great strait. I don't know what to do, which of these choices to take. But here, I take it, here's his answer, here's his choice. Let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for very great are his mercies, but let me not fall into the hand of men. So the prophet came to David, because you numbered the people, David was penitent. He confessed that sin to God, but there are consequences. And so God said, here's 3 options. David, pick. And let me see. And so David says, I'd like to fall into the hands of the Lord. Well, in verses 14 through 17, the Lord sent pestilence, that third option. 70,000 men of Israel fell. So as God's angel was destroying Jerusalem, God said to the angel, it's enough, stay your hand. David saw the angel, and he petitioned God to spare the people. In verse 14, so the Lord sent pestilence upon Israel, and there fell of Israel 70,000 men, and God sent an angel unto Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was destroying, the Lord beheld and repented him of the evil, and said to the angel that destroyed, it is enough. Stay thou thy hand. And the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And David lifted up his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord stand between the earth and the heaven, having a sword drawn in his hand, a drawn sword in his hand stretched out over Jerusalem. Then David and the elders of Israel, who were clothed in sackcloth, fell upon their faces. And David said unto God, is it not I that commanded thee, the people to be numbered? Lord, I did it. I commanded it. Even is it not I that have sinned and have done evil indeed? But as for these sheep, what have they done? Let thy hand, I pray thee, O Lord my God, be on me and on my father's house, but not on thy people, that they should be plagued. So David is interceding for the people. So God sent a plague, 70,000 men of Israel fell. One commentator, Albert Barnes, made this comment. He said, it's the most destructive plague recorded as having fallen upon the Israelites. In the plague that he gave a couple of other examples, he said in the plague that followed the rebellion of Korah, there died almost 15,000 men. In the plague on the account of Baal Peor, about 24,000 died, as in Numbers 25, verse 9. So 70,000 men of Israel fell. Well, David asked Ornan to grant him the threshing floor. So David was going to make an offering. He sees this area owned by Ornan or Araunah, and he says he wants to buy it. And what was that famous phrase that David used in regard to that? You know, Araunah was saying, "I'll just take it. You know, I'll give you the cattle too." What's that famous phrase that David said? Right. Right. I'm not going to offer something to God that did not cost me anything. In 1 Chronicles 21, verse 18. Then the angel of the Lord commanded Gad to go to David and say to David that David should go up, set up an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And David went up by the saying of Gad, which he spake in the name of the Lord. And Ornan turned back and saw the angel, and his 4 sons with him. And his 4 sons with him hid themselves. Now Ornan was threshing wheat. So God, the prophet tells David what he should do, and Ornan looks up and he sees the angel that's destroying. And as David came to Ornan, Ornan looked and saw David and went out of the threshing floor and bowed himself to David, and with his face to the ground. And David said to Ornan, "Grant me the place of this threshing floor, give it to me, that I may build an altar therein unto the Lord. Thou shalt grant it me for the full price, that the plague may be stayed from the people." And Ornan said unto David, "Take it to thee, and let my lord the king do that which is good in his eyes. Lo, I give thee the oxen also for burnt offerings, and the threshing instruments for wood, and the wheat for the meat offering I give thee. I'll give you everything you need, David. Just say it and I'll give it to you." King David said to Ornan, "Nay, but I will verily buy it of thee a full price. For I will not take that which is thine for the Lord, nor offer burnt offerings without cost." So David gave to Ornan for the place 600 shekels of gold by weight. And David built there an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and called upon the Lord. And he answered him from heaven by fire upon the altar of burnt offering. That reminds you of another time of offering when the Lord answered by fire. And the Lord commanded the angel, and he put up his sword again unto the sheath thereof. At that time when David saw that the Lord had answered him in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, Then he sacrificed there. So it looks like David continues to sacrifice in the same place because, hey, the Lord's there, and he answers me there. For the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses made in the wilderness, and the altar of the burnt offering were at that season in the high place at Gibeon. But David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid because of the sword of the angel of the Lord. Okay, any comments or questions or anything up to this point before we look at the psalm of David's praise for deliverance from all of his enemies as part of this lesson also, and we'll turn back to 2 Samuel 22 and the parallel. Basically, Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22, they're the same, but we'll look at 2 Samuel chapter 22. But before we do that, any comments or questions? Okay, going back to 2 Samuel 22. And this is a beautiful psalm, a beautiful statement of praise and request to God. And I've kind of outlined here 5 points in this psalm, Psalm 18 or 2 Samuel 22. Let me just run over these points, and then what we'll do is we'll go one by one. I really wish that we had time to read the passage, but we won't have time to do that. I'll pick out some select verses, some highlights in each of these sections, try to, and make some applications. David's song was prompted by his understanding that God had delivered him from all his enemies. We see that in verse 1. David could call upon God and God would deliver him. You know, so the basis of this whole psalm is that David knew God delivered me. I was in trouble. I cried to God. God delivered me. Heaven and earth were under God's control and would bend at his will in the next section. God helped David because he delighted in him and did God's will. This is, I think, very important. David makes the statement, and I've got the passages here referenced, and we'll try to read them. David makes the statement. I want to make application about that. David makes the statement that the reason why God delivered him was that God delighted in him. He was doing God's will. Well, David, what about Bathsheba? David, what about Uriah? David, what about numbering the people? I've done God's will, and God delighted in me. We want to look at that. How could David say that? We can say that. God gave David the strength to accomplish what he did. It was all God. It's God that works in us to will and to do of his good pleasure. God helps us. You know, God strengthens us. God shows us the way through his word. But God gives us the strength through others. David could call upon God and God would deliver him. In 2 Samuel 22 and verse 1, David spake unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord had delivered him out of the hand of all his enemies and out of the hand of Saul. In verse 4, I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. And then verse 50, therefore, because of what God has done for me, therefore I will give thanks unto thee, O Lord, among the heathen. I'll praise you. Lord, you've delivered me. I'll praise you. So David could call upon God and God would deliver him. Some applications. Let's remember God's instructions on prayer in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and how that, let me see, did I skip something here? Oh, yeah, let's not forget to give God thanks for his blessings. A couple of other things to reference. Remember the lepers that were healed? What did the Lord say? Where are the 9? Only one turned back to give God praise and thanks. Let's not forget to us also, just like David. We think about the benefit of the Old Testament. We see a good example here of someone praising God, crying to God and praising God for his blessings. And so we should do the same. Let's remember God's instructions on prayer, 1 Timothy 2, and how that one of the things that God wants us to do is to give thanks for all men. We need to be a thankful people. Give thanks for all men, including rulers. Our thanks to God for rulers is, it looks like to me in that text, 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 4, perhaps is the basis on which God gives us a quiet and peaceable life. You want a quiet and peaceable life? Thank God for rulers. Thank God for people. Are there perhaps Abraham's 10 righteous in the U.S. who sustain the country by their lives, by their righteous lives, and their obedience of prayer? Look at that passage in 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 4. I will therefore that given a prayer, and I can't quote it, but all of these different types of prayer, one of which is giving of thanks. Let's give thanks for all men. Let's give thanks for rulers, that the Lord may give us a quiet and peaceable life. David could call upon God. God would deliver him. God allowed David to suffer. God allows us to suffer. But that does not mean that he does not care or that he does not exist. David, so amazing. All that he went through, and anything that I might say that I've gone through, pales in comparison, does it not? But all that David went through, he still cried and leaned upon God. No, the fact that I go through things doesn't mean God doesn't exist or that he doesn't care. No, David shows that he did. God helped David because he delighted in him and did God's will. In verses 17, and we're running out of time, but look at chapter 22 and verses 20 through 24. 20 through 24. This is so powerful, I believe. He brought me forth into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. You remember what David said when they were leaving the city of Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant was coming, and David said, no, take that back. If what? If the Lord delights in me, I'll go back. So he said, the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. He delights in me. He rewarded me. So I'm doing what is right. How, in summary, how can David say these things? Well, David, what about Bathsheba? What about Uriah? What about what about all those things? How can David say that? The blessedness of forgiveness, is it not? Romans chapter 4, even David speaks of the blessedness of the one to whom the Lord will not impute sin. He quotes Psalm 32. So David could say all of these things because he had been forgiven. So you're forgiven. You're living righteously. You're pleasing to God. Someone points to what you've done. Wasn't I forgiven of that? Didn't I turn from that? Ezekiel chapter 18, if the wicked man turns from his sins, he'll live and not die spiritually. He's okay. He's safe because he's been forgiven. He'll live spiritually and not die spiritually. God gave David the strength to accomplish all that he did. And let's see if I've got a passage on that verse 30. Verse 30. For by thee I have run through a troop. By thee, by my God, have I leaped over a wall. So God gave David strength to do what he did. In this account, God avenged David of all his enemies. He said in verse 48, it is God that avengeth me. In this Old Testament account, but also God authorized David to avenge himself. Look at, I've got a string of verses, and in all of those verses, David shows how that he did these things. God avenges him, but God gave him the right to do it. David, you do it. How does it say? You've taught my hands to war. Verse 41, you've given me the necks of my enemies, so that I might destroy them that hate me. So, Lord, avenge me. But then God gave him the right to do it. Here's the point. In contrast, under the New Testament, God commands Christians not to take vengeance. Romans 12. Romans 12, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves. So, God avenged David, but gave David the authority to destroy his enemies. God avenges us. He'll get it done. He'll do it, but he tells us not to. Okay, and I see I would have had another moment maybe to read a little bit more, but I'll leave it open to you. Any comments, questions on the class? It was just a beautiful psalm, Psalm 18, showing God's power, showing his reliance on God, deliverance by God, and showing that if just as David, if God can delight in him and him be forgiven, he can delight in us when we're forgiven. The power of forgiveness. Thank you all for your comments. And next lesson, lesson 7, 2 Samuel 21 and 23 in 1 Chronicles 22 through 29. Looks like a lot of text there, David.
Good evening. Most of you know that I had been a coach for 53 years at Athens Bible School, and just recently retired from active coaching. Sometime about 25 years ago, there was an internet story that came out about cross country, and cross country was one of the sports that I coached. It was a story about someone attending a race and watching as the runners disappeared off into the distance, and yet people would be saying, sort of silently, talking to themselves, "Run," and a name, "Run." Now, obviously, the runners could not hear that encouragement, but they were encouraging them to run. And the story tells about a mother in heels even, as her daughter was struggling to finish the race. She was yelling out her name and encouraging her to run, run. And she wasn't encouraging her to win the race. The winners had long since gone by. She was just urging her to finish the race. Well, sometime after reading that article, I put together this presentation. It may have been one that I did many years ago. I know I did it in chapel at Athens Bible School. The race before us, and it comes from Hebrews chapter 12, the first and part of the second verse. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus. Well, cross-country runners can tell you that when they hear their name, when they hear people encourage them, they try harder. They go a little bit faster. They might pass one or two extra people. So hearing the crowd is an incentive. Well, hearing the crowd that was mentioned in this first verse, all of these servants mentioned in the next 38 verses, all of them of past faithful servants. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, since we are surrounded by that great cloud of witnesses. Now, why did the Holy Spirit eulogize them? In Hebrews 11:39-40, it says, and all of these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. In Romans 15:4, it says, for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. We might run our race. Just as the writer of Hebrews was telling them about that crowd of past faithful servants and witnesses, there exists a crowd of current faithful servants. They surround the present day runners, as we can look around in the audience tonight and see each other. Present day people to encourage us. These people inspire us with their faithfulness. It's often said that we see some in the audience that struggle just to get ready to come to services. But here they are, and that's a great encouragement. So current faithful servants encourage us. And you can ask any runner, and as I look out tonight, I see several of you who used to run for us at Athens Bible School. Some are sitting there that are current runners at Athens Bible School, and they'll tell you a crowd will spur them on. Now, cross country is a 5,000-meter run, up hills, sometimes jumping ditches, sometimes even going through creeks. Those are obstacles that the runner has to take into account. Well, runners in a cross-country race, though, cannot run with unnecessary hindrances, such as ankle weights that people sometimes work out with, or weight vests that they may wear to try to build their leg muscles so they can jump higher. Well, likewise, runners in this race of life cannot run with unnecessary hindrances. What are the hindrances? Well, in the race of life, these entanglements or these hindrances, sin is the biggest entanglement, the biggest hindrance. And we must make every effort to set these aside, to remove them from us today. So, how about removing the obstacles? What are your obstacles today? There are many different ones, but here's a list of some that might be: lying, stealing, cheating, smoking, drinking, drugs. What about bad language? Sex outside of marriage, pornography. What about just being disrespectful? How about being a bully? Or how about having just a sour attitude? Those are all obstacles that people in this life have to overcome. Well, they may not be your obstacles, but you could make other list of obstacles that you face daily. Well, this race must be met with determination to finish it. It must be run with endurance or perseverance, another definition of that word. The meaning of run, it's a continual process. It's not just that you actually take off into a run. When you stop running and are walking, it's still doing the run of life that I'm talking about. And runners must never quit running this race. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, "Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain." Now, the race is set before its runners. In cross country, the course is not selected by those who are actually running the race, and runners cannot choose their own shortcuts. That would be cause for disqualification in the race. Runners must respect the race directors. They must respect the ones that have set it up and outlined the course. Likewise, runners in our life must respect the authority of life's race. In Luke, the 6th chapter, in verse 46, Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?" If we're going to respect the authorities, we will obey the laws, obey the rules, and we will do as they instruct us to. Successful cross-country runners are focused. They will keep their eye on their target. They will not be distracted. They may pick out a runner 2 or 3 positions up and say to themselves, I'm going to catch that person by the 1 mile mark, or I'm going to catch that person by the 2,000 meter mark or the 3,000 meter mark. And they pass that one, then they'll set their eyes on another target that they will try to overtake. They look where they're going. They don't want to step in a hole. They don't want to step on a rock and turn an ankle. They are anxiously looking for the finish line. It's the goal of every cross-country runner to reach the finish line. It's the goal of our run in life to reach the finish line. We will be focused. We'll keep our eye on the target. We will not be distracted. We will look where we are stepping, and we will fix our eyes on Jesus. Thayer defines this as to turn the eyes away from other things and to look at only one thing. Jesus is always our example to emulate, especially when considering his earthly sojourn. In Hebrews, the 4th chapter, verses 14 and 15, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. We will not run successfully if we take our eyes off of Jesus. Having our eyes on him means that we're going to practice, that we're going to read the Bible, that we're going to make great preparation. Just as a cross-country runner often runs through the summer, through the fall, running a few races to prepare for the state race, the final of the season, takes training. 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27. Paul says, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. The race will not always be easy. We have to run the straight and narrow way, as Matthew 7:14 says, but small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life. It will be a conflict or a fight. Philippians 1:30, experiencing the same conflict. Our life, our race in life will have many conflicts. Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 6:12, fight the good fight of faith. It's a fight. It's an effort. Same word is used as the word for race in Hebrews 12:1. Yet God has set this race before us and has commanded us to run it. And we have a crowd to cheer us on. Each other. let's encourage each other so much the more as we see the day drawing nigh. We have a finish line on which to focus, and we must remove all of the encumbrances, all of the hindrances, overcome all of the obstacles, and we will need endurance to complete it. Have you started your race? Have you been baptized for the remission of your sins, accepted Jesus, His commands, and applied them to your life? If you have done that, are you still on course? Or do you need the prayers of the church to help you get back on course? If you're in any way subject to the invitation, we bid you to come while we stand and sing.